Good morning. It's Saturday, April 19th, 2025. We welcome you and our guest speaker, Dr. Patrick Lacroix, to the French Canadian Heritage Society of Michigan's monthly membership meeting, which is being recorded. Please consider becoming a member to show your support for our programming. Our monthly meeting schedules are published online at habitatheritage.org and on our Facebook page. A membership form will be located in the chat. In the short, I'd like to introduce our membership chair, John Vernew. John?
Greetings, everybody. I just want to echo what our president, Eva, has said about joining the French Canadian Heritage Society of Michigan. I know that several people are joining our lecture this morning and they found the link through Facebook or some other place. And I just want to let you know that your membership, which is not very expensive, it's $35 for a year, really helps us continue the great work that our society has been doing in terms of French Canadian heritage. Your membership, of course, gets you our wonderful journal published 4 times a year in hard copy form or electronic form. Your membership also gets you into our website, and you can access all 46 years of our journal online. So there are lots of great opportunities and great things to have when you are a member of our society. And I just want to also reiterate that your membership helps us keep going and doing great things. There is a membership form that will be attached to the chat. You can also find that form online. You can join by either sending us a check, or you can join online as well. If you experience any difficulty in the online process, feel free to email me at membership@habitatheritage.org. and I'll be happy to help you join online. It's a little bit cumbersome, and some people get a little bit frustrated. Happy to help you with that. I even have pictures on how to join. So get in touch with me at membership@habitatheritage.org, and that's the end of my blurb.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. I'd like to remind everybody to please stay muted during the presentation. Questions are welcome and encouraged. Type your name in the chat to be called upon at the end of Dr. Lacroix's presentation. Now I'd like to, and I'm excited to introduce our society's author, Gail Moreau-Desharnais, to tell you about her most recent book. Gail?
Okay, we've recently published The Burials of Saint Anne du Détroit, 1706-1805. It's fully annotated. It gives you the name of the person who died, the date of their burial, the names of their parents' marriage. If the person was actually born in France, if possible, we've included that baptismal record also. We also have available a 2-volume set of Detroit 1701-1710, fully documented, and of everything that happened in Detroit in the first 9 years. That was done in conjunction with Diane Shepard, and also volume 2 is by the late Suzanne Somerville. Then Diane and I last year did the next set of books, which is 1711-1720, fully documented on those years in Detroit. It includes the parish registers, the contracts for the voyageurs, etc. You can go to our website and you can find out how to order the books or get more details, or you can contact me at store@habitatheritage.org and I will answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Okay, so on with today's presentation. I'd like to hand off today's presentation to our program chairperson, Daniel Ryu. Daniel?
Thank you, Eva. Patrick Lacroix is the Director of Acadian Archives at the University of Maine's Fort Kent campus. Go Bears. He has had articles on Acadian history and published and has taught classes on Acadian history too. His topic today will be, what were the economic, political, and social developments that triggered French-Canadian movement into the U.S., especially the New England states, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Dr. Lacroix will, again, like Eva said, take the questions after the presentation. So if you want to ask him a question, go ahead and put your name in the chat, and we'll try to get as many of you as Dr. Lacroix's time will permit. So I do want to mention too, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our member website for your future review. So if you don't agree to have your voice and or image shared publicly, we advise you to stay muted with your camera off. Further, while the Society has recently relaunched its YouTube channel, it hasn't yet been determined whether Dr. Lacroix's presentation today will be available there in the future, but more to come on that. So without further ado, Dr. Lacroix.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure, a privilege to be joining you today to talk about a topic we're all invested in and excited about. To me, it's especially wonderful to notice familiar faces among our attendees today, folks from Clinton County, New York, and Newport, Vermont, and some of our friends of the archives in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and a lot of wonderful new faces, or at least new faces to me. So I look forward to engaging more with you at the end of the talk through questions and comments. I'm joining you today from the Acadian Archives, as Daniel hinted at, in beautiful, not sunny, but beautiful Fort Kent today. And I hope that this will be an opportunity for you to take interest in what the Acadian Archives do. Although today I won't be talking a whole lot about Acadians, I'll be focusing on French Canadians, meaning people who originally settled in the St. Lawrence River Valley in what is today Quebec, initially mostly between Quebec City and Montreal, but further downstream as well. And of course, from that population, eventually there was significant population growth, as we'll see in the next few slides, and I'll share my screen in just a moment. And that led to immigration across borders and into the United States. So thank you all for signing up, and hopefully this will be a good journey. I should mention also, occasionally, by virtue of the technology I'm interacting with, my audio will drop for a few seconds. So if it does, don't worry, it should be back pretty quickly. But I'm sure that Eva or Daniel or somebody else will let me know, since I'll be sharing my screen and might not be able to see your comments. So here we go. I will share my screen. This will take a few seconds. And there we go. So hopefully that's visible to all of you. So we'll talk about the origins of the French-Canadian exodus over the course of technically 35 years, but we'll go further back, much further back, and we'll move past the 1860s as well towards the end if we have enough time. And I look forward to your questions once again. All right, so we'll jump into this. I said we'd go way back. We're going way back, and we're not going to spend too much time on the colonial period, but this is simply to acknowledge that this presence of French Canadians or people of French Canadian descent on what would eventually be the US doesn't start in the 1830s or 40s or 50s or 1880s. It starts much earlier. And because these communities form during the period of New France, the migration story is very different from what I'll be sharing today. So if we don't talk too much about some of these early settlements in Indiana and Illinois and Michigan, that's the reason. It's not that I'm unaware of them or I'm not trying to ignore some of these communities. They just have a very different history from the large-scale migration that erupts out of Quebec in the 1820s and 1830s. And of course, this map is, I say of course, maybe that's not fair, but is a fiction to a great extent. Right. It's very impressive. We think that New France occupied nearly half of the continent. The reality is French settlement was mostly confined to waterways, to rivers, to lakes. And there was a very thin string of forts, of missions, of fur trading posts. The vast majority of this big blue space was actually occupied and controlled by indigenous groups, whom I also want to acknowledge. And the fact that the French were able to expand along some of these waterways was made possible by the know-how and the alliances of these indigenous groups. So that's a slightly different story from, as I mentioned, from what I'll be sharing today. That being said, some of those waterways would become significant in a later period as well, as people of French Canadian descent, again, out of Lower Canada slowly made their way south into New England and a little bit further west around the Great Lakes. So I've mentioned some of these important points, the communities that, again, I'm not ignoring, but have a very different history. Vincennes, Kaskaskia, St. Genevieve in Missouri. Some of you are very well acquainted with some of this history. We can point you towards different sources, but there are some people who've done way more research on the Midwest than I have. So I'll be talking about the continental perspective at a very high level, and we'll show some primary documents that speak to it. But there are other great authors that I can point you to that would provide a little bit more information about some of these very interesting communities that have a very long history across the continent. One thing we'll talk a little bit more about is the U.S. War of Independence. After 1763, nearly all of North America belongs, at least officially, to the British. The indigenous groups have, for very good reason, objections to that, partly because they've been sovereign since time immemorial. But it's going to be significant partly because it splits the Anglo-American sphere of North America and ultimately French Canadians who, as of 1763, are living under British rule. They'll have to make a decision about their allegiances. And that's going to become significant as the first very small wave of French Canadian migrants make their way to what is eventually the United States. I'll talk about that as well. So what I mean by this very first and very small wave of French Canadian immigrants, during the American Revolution, actually 250 years ago this year, there was an invasion of Quebec by the Continental Army. Even though all this belonged technically to the British, at least on paper, the Continental Army and the Continental Congress had very different ideas about the fate of the continent, as we know, from their push to, to become more democratic and to eventually seek independence starting in 1776. So there's this invasion of Quebec that some of you may be acquainted with that lasts about 9 months, roughly, from the fall of 1775 to June of 1776. And during that time, while continental forces are in control of most of what is today the province of Quebec, French Canadians have to decide, are we going to stick with the British, who've been in charge for, about 15 years, or are we going to turn to the Americans and perhaps become independent or have greater freedom? And the population is split. But ultimately, there are some French Canadian men who do enlist with the Continental Army during the occupation. And then as the occupation collapses in the spring of 1776, they will have nowhere to go. They're persona non grata in Lower Canada or the province of Quebec at that time. And if they stay, they're going to end up being jailed or losing all their properties to the British. So they follow the army and they're going to serve through the entire course of the American Revolution, the War of Independence, all the way to 1783. 1783 rolls around and they still can't go back home. They're still political refugees by virtue of the choices they've made. So as a result of that, kind of taking pity on them, the New York State Legislature is going to grant them lands. And that's going to happen on the western shore of Lake Champlain. So right between Vermont and New York on the New York side, and very close to the border as well. And that enables them to remain in contact, in touch with family, with friends, possibly economic opportunities as well. And we have very good traces of those families, partly because even though they can't settle in Lower Canada regularly, they'll cross the border to seek baptisms, to seek the official blessing for marriages. Some of them will be buried in the parish of Chambly, just across the border in Lower Canada. So we do have parish records that trace the history of that group of initially about 500 men who sign up with the Continental Army. But what ultimately happens, many of them desert, some of them won't follow through, some of them will leave Continental service just before the retreat out of Quebec. And so ultimately, it's a very small group of people, I believe less than 100 or about 100 that settle permanently on the western shore of Lake Champlain. I mentioned that partly because we should know about it, especially with the 250th anniversary of the founding of the country, arguably, here that French Canadians were part and parcel of the founding of the United States almost from day one. even before the Declaration of Independence. But I mention it also as an outlier because even though you have this small group of families clinging to the shores of Lake Champlain in the 1780s and 90s, that doesn't, in the short term, create the necessary conditions to further out migration from Lower Canada. In other words, it's not the spark for chain migration. Um, and what I want to study a little bit with you in the course of this presentation is the necessary preconditions. So what actually had to happen for there to be a large exodus, a large movement of expatriates from Lower Canada, from the St. Lawrence River Valley. Those conditions aren't present in the 1770s or 80s, but they will be about a generation later. So we're going to delve into that in the next few minutes. Okay, so this is going to be very intimidating at first glimpse if you've never seen this before. There's a lot of writing, there's a lot of numbers, it's small print, and I apologize. But it's also really cool. And I'll be glad to share the original image with Eva or Daniel after the fact, so that you can, for those of you who are serious researchers, you want to dive into this, you're interested by numbers, you can look at this on your own time and kind of dissect it and have fun with it. For now, I'll mention that these different bars for all of these different regions across the map show the population at specific points in time for those regions. So the lower bar on the left, if we take the upper left-hand corner here, this is the northern region just above Montreal. So you have the first bar, which is 1784. That's the population at that time, 14,000 people. Then you have the next bar here, that's 1831, 1851, and finally the final bar, 1871. You'll notice that for a lot of regions all across the St. Lawrence River Valley, there is a huge gap between 1784 and 1831. And that's when there's a very large increase in the population of what is then a colony. And in the case of, that area north of Montreal, that's about a 4 to 5 fold increase in population over the course of just a few generations. There's a striking rise here at the bottom, at the center at the bottom, Rive Sud de Montréal, which is roughly the Richelieu River, Yamaska, the area close to Longueuil as well, for those of you who know your Quebec geography. So you go from having 22,000 people, a mere 22,000 people, we might say, in 1784 to nearly 120,000. So that's roughly a 5-fold increase over the course of a few generations. So that's one of the basic economic and social facts of Lower Canada in this period is huge population growth. And some of you might have traveled into Quebec. I don't know where everyone is located exactly, uh, but you may have driven up into Quebec from I-87 or I-89, and you drive through these cornfields, and it looks very lush. You'll go perhaps to Ile d'Orléans, or some people call it the Isle of Orleans, which again is flat, it's agricultural farmland. So at first glimpse, Quebec, at least for people who are sticking to the center of the province, might seem like a very agriculturally fertile land. But in reality, if you look at the horizon, it's hills and there are mountains in the distance. And that's the Canadian Shield or the Appalachians. And only so much of that can be exploited agriculturally. So you have a rising population that rises very quickly over the course of a few generations, and only so much land that can be exploited at a time when the vast majority of French Canadians are making a living or surviving through agriculture. So that poses a substantial challenge in terms of making sure that the next generation will also have access to land, that they'll be able to support a household or a family of their own. So again, I share this partly because the numbers are very striking, especially for that early period. And it's, a slightly longer gap than the interval between the next two periods on this map. But 1784 to 1831, suddenly we're coming close to a challenge. I'll also caution, and offer this caveat, the fact that agricultural production also increases during this period. So it's not simply that, oh, we're producing the same amount and we have to feed 5 times the number of people. Agricultural production rises. Better fertilizers, the use of fertilizers, including animal fertilizers, is part of it. crop rotation. There are different techniques that can be employed. So hardly ever is agricultural production stable or the potential yield of lands stable. We've certainly seen that in the last 50 and 60 years with the rise of commercial agriculture, different strands of seeds and crops, fertilizers, and so forth. So it's not, the problem isn't necessarily that people won't be able to feed themselves. It's making sure that individual households have the land to support themselves, to create new households um, at a basic level. So that's an important fact. I wanted to put that out there in the background because that's going to shape what happens in the 1820s and 30s and afterwards. Okay, so we have in this group, we have serious researchers who are writing, who have, a deep interest, who are going to follow every little footnote that I offer. We either have other folks who are here just to learn generally, provide context maybe on what their ancestors experienced. So I'm trying to speak to both groups overall. So this is very in the weeds. So some of you might want to tune out for the next few minutes, but it's very interesting to note the debate that's occurred between scholars, people who do a lot of research, as to the causes of outmigration. It's not as simple as, oh, huge population growth, rebellion, great opportunities in the US. There's a lot of debate as to the interplay of those different factors. So in the 1960s, this fellow who's pictured here, Fernand Ouellet, argued that the primary cause of the crisis that shakes Lower Canada in the 19th century was a primarily agricultural crisis. And that, in fact, in the early years of the 19th century, the aughts and the 1810s, that wheat production collapses. And French Canadians are no longer exporting their wheat, partly because there's competition from Upper Canada, there's competition from the United States, and they're facing very difficult straits. And so they suddenly produce a lot less. And from a commercial economy in the 1810s, suddenly Lower Canada becomes a subsistence economy, partly because they can't export their wheat anymore. That's his argument. He also states that farmers are risk averse, which typically is true. You don't want to gamble on different crops that might not fit well with the climate or the soil of Lower Canada. And he says that farmers are also typically conservative in their mindset and their techniques. They're going to risk going with something that's worked most of the time, half of the time, rather than take a chance on something that might not work out agriculturally, meaning trying different crops or different techniques. And then afterwards, after Willett had put that out there, as always happens, scholars came in and said, no, 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 that's not the way it happened, just feeding into the debate. And there are other authors, Paquet and Wallo, notably, don't have to remember the names if you don't want to. They argued that farmers, these Lower Canadian farmers from the early 19th century, they were savvy, they were market savvy, they were rational actors in the market, they understood how the economy worked, and they saw what was happening. They saw that, oh, we're being outproduced and outcompeted by different regions when it comes to wheat production. So we're simply going to shift and we're going to produce more peas and buckwheat and potatoes and other crops, maybe oats and barley, and we're going to make a profit that way. So wheat might not be the best indicator of how people felt about the economy or about their own specific circumstances. So the debate goes on still today, and we've seen papers emerge pretty recently on that huge topic of whether there's an agricultural crisis per se happening. And that's pretty big, that debate, because it feeds directly into whether we should consider whether people left the province because of their agricultural straits, or was it because of other factors, right? So I'm putting this out there. I think there are some factors that are more significant, as I'll argue in the next few minutes, than a potential collapse of wheat production in the 19th century. And those factors emerge in the 1830s and 40s, especially when we have the first spurt of migration from Lower Canada. I'll just add one more point here with regard to an argument that Alan Greer, a very prolific and knowledgeable scholar, has made. And Alan Greer argues that there's no net, this is his term, pauperization, meaning people are not becoming more impoverished in this period. And his argument is that the real challenge is the intergenerational transfer of wealth that I kind of alluded to earlier, meaning that established households are still doing well, but they're increasingly having challenges with the younger generation who might not have access to land, making sure that they can establish themselves, that they can have a household of their own, that they can marry, be a, an eligible and attractive prospect for a young woman if you're a young man, meaning having the property and the means necessary to support your wife and support your children, since this is still a predominantly patriarchal society, as we know, in this period. So the argument for Greer is that, if you already have land through the 1830s and 40s, you're going to do pretty well. You have your land, but then you might have 8 children. So how do you set up 8 children for success in life? Well, four or five of those might be young women. So, it's up to them to find a good suitor who himself has means, but then you might have 4 or 5 sons, and you have to make sure that they're able to support themselves in life. And with limited access to land, then you're suddenly reliant on wage labor. And we'll talk about wage labor in just a moment. Okay, so I mentioned there are factors that might be more significant than wheat production or lack of wheat production in the early 19th century. So I apologize about the resolution of some of these images. Hopefully, for those of you who want to read along, it'll be big enough on your screen to read along. In the 1830s and 1840s, there are major, I dare say, crises facing agriculture in Lower Canada. Those crises relate not so much about what's being produced as infestations and the climate. So these are outside forces with which Lower Canadian farmers have to contend, and there isn't much they can do with, bug infestations and with the climate. It's beyond their means. So they'll have to adapt as best as they can, and some we know will struggle to do so for all sorts of really good reasons. So I'll start with the article on the left, and this is in the context of agricultural reports that were published across Lower Canadian newspapers in the St. Lawrence River Valley, predominantly Montreal and Quebec City, from the late 1810s onward. And often they're published on a monthly basis. There's a fellow by the name of William Evans, if I remember correctly, who visits different areas of the province, and he sends these in to let people know. And it's valuable from an economic standpoint so that merchants know exactly what's going to happen. Will they have to raise prices, or will they have to find, new outlets for products? So there's economic value to this. And of course, historically, there's value to us in terms of understanding, exactly what was happening on the ground in different regions of the colony. So 1835, in the midst of a pretty difficult period politically in Lower Canada, starts with the month of July was moist and warm throughout and has greatly forwarded the growth of the late sown crops. So the climate is great. 1835 July was perfect for agriculture, at least in this region. But then we have this, and this is very telling of the fate of wheat, uh, uh, on which most French Canadians rely at this point in time in the 1830s. The wheat has suffered extremely by vermin, which have consumed the grain in the ear, or the matter which was destined to form the grain. There is no doubt that the maggot, which has been so destructive, was produced by a fly known in Britain as the wheat fly, depositing its eggs in the glooms of the wheat ear immediately after they are shot out. The crop of wheat from this cause will in many fields be almost a total failure. And then the author, which I think again is William Evans, goes on to argue that barley has also suffered, oats have also suffered by this maggot. Um, Peas are not a good crop generally, meaning this year in 1835. Um, Indian corn, the prospects are not great for maize. And then potatoes, right at the end, again on the left-hand side here, they've suffered from the potato rot, um, in a way that parallels what's happening in Ireland at this point in time. And it's not going to be nearly as devastating as it is in Ireland, but of course, in Lower Canada, it's also going to affect the potato crop. So very difficult circumstances. And again, it's all because of this invasion, this infestation of the wheat fly. It's also called the Hessian fly they're going to lay their eggs in the stalk of the wheat, and within a few weeks in the spring, those eggs, those maggots, they're going to start eating through the crop even before it can be harvested. So leads to complete devastation. It will lead to hunger and to lean years in the mid 1830s, and it takes years to recover from that. So in response, French Canadian farmers are going to shift to other crops. So again, they're technically risk averse, but they at this point realize that year after year, that infestation is going to come back, and they're going to have insects eating through their wheat before they can. So they'll shift to, again, potatoes. Potatoes are kind of suffering in this period, barley and oats. But there are a lot of challenges in terms of actual agriculture in the province. And for those of you who are interested in agriculture, you can do a deep dive on this. I'm happy to share my sources because there's a lot out there about agriculture. And then in the second report, this one is from 1836. This is mostly about the climate. Um, and it starts, I'll just read the first paragraph very quickly for those of you who might not be able to read this. During the 16 years that we have furnished agricultural reports for the Quebec Gazette, we never sat down to the task with such unfavorable forebodings as at present. So that tells you that the circumstances in the 1830s are not great for farmers, again, at a time when the colony is overwhelmingly dependent on agriculture. So part of it is the climate, part of it is these infestations, and it will lead to very difficult circumstances and may ultimately lead more and more people to move to the US for wage labor. Not necessarily to buy farms, because American farms at the same time are also contending with the Hessian fly, the wheat fly, and some of these climatic events. All right, so that's our agricultural woes at this period. So I've mentioned some of these factors, especially in the 1830s, but they continue into the 1840s as well. And then I mentioned very briefly, I was kind of tantalizing you with this, the fact that in the 1830s, difficult political times in Lower Canada. This is a period we often call the springtime of nations. It's the era of Jacksonian democracy in the US, when the ballot becomes more accessible to more groups of people, new groups of people who had been previously disenfranchised. It's happening in Europe. There are revolutions and insurrections in Europe, people seeking the ballot, seeking more freedoms, more rights. It's also happening in Lower Canada. Even if Lower Canada has a broader franchise, more people can vote, even though it's a relatively free colony, there are very serious concerns about access to positions of power. And this is in a colonial world. Britain, of course, is the colonial power in Lower Canada, and therefore they kind of have a monopoly on certain institutions. So increasingly, there will be a movement towards, I guess, an insurgency, partly because there are blockages everywhere. They petition to Britain, and these Canadians are dissatisfied, especially led by their patriot leaders, dissatisfied with the course of political events. They don't feel represented or that the Crown is speaking to their specific concerns. So as a result, eventually feeling that there's no outlet, no safe, peaceful political outlet for their anger, the colony in certain regions specifically, not the entire colony as a whole, but some regions will erupt in protest and even in insurgency. In the fall of 1837, there are clashes, military clashes between these patriots who are seeking greater democracy and British troops. It's a failure on the part of the Patriots, meaning that they are defeated militarily, and there will be a second revolt in the fall of 1838. And as a result of that, they'll be defeated again. Those are pretty sorry insurrections in the sense that they're poorly organized and they don't get the support from the US that they had expected. They had thought that the Americans would come in as, freedom fighters and support them in their quest for independence and for political freedoms. That doesn't happen. And in the wake of the second rebellion in 1838, whereas the response had been pretty lenient after the first rebellion, the British, released most of the prisoners that had been in Montreal, those who had participated in the insurrection. That's the first rebellion. After the second one, the response is much harsher. And here on the slide, I use a euphemism, pacification. That's the word used notably by British officials in the 1830s following these rebellions. But they they cut a wide swath of devastation in the lower part of the province, especially south of Montreal, a little bit less the Richelieu parishes in this period. Um, but Châteauguay, Vaudreuil, Soulanges, those regions are hit pretty hard by British troops coming through and intimidating, in some cases, burning down farmhouses and barns. So those folks, if they can't be taken in by family that might be nearby, they're going to go to the US. They will feel very unwelcome, with reason, in Lower Canada. So we have a few phases of Lower Canadian political refugees. The first is fairly small. We're talking about a few hundred people that escaped to the US after 1837. And then after 1838, it's a much larger number of folks who suffered both politically and economically, because the two are entwined in the late 1830s. So that's going to be a much more substantial wave than what we saw, say, in 1775 or 1776. As though that wasn't enough. We've talked about the wheat midge, we've talked about population growth, we've talked about the rebellions, a lot of different factors coming together in this period. There are also shocks in the lumber industry. I won't talk too much about tariffs, which many of you are contending with at the moment. But tariffs are a big issue in the 1840s as well. Repeatedly, in the 1840s, Britain changes its commercial policy, international commercial policy, with regard to lumber. So it puts tariffs on, then it takes them off, then it chooses imperial preference. Then it decides to have a different arrangement with the US and with other countries, especially the Baltic countries, which are another source of lumber. This is all in the context of Canada offering the bulk of the lumber that supplies the British Navy and British construction needs. So lumber becomes not quite a close second to agriculture in terms of the significance to the Lower Canadian economy, but internationally, that lumber is important. And then you have all these policy reversals that I just described: tariffs, no tariffs, reciprocity, imperial preference. And that's also happening in the context of a debate over free trade in Britain. There are no new things in history, right? We've seen this before. So that's a problem for the substantial number of young men, especially, who had been engaged in the lumber industry from the late 1810s onward in Quebec. Those who had traveled to lumber camps for about 6 months every year and who'd be charged with logging, cutting down trees, would be part of yarding crews, constructing rafts so that all that wood would be floated down to Montreal, to Quebec City, and to other locations to be shipped eventually to Britain. That's a big part of the story. And now suddenly, the investors don't know where to go with this, and they're reluctant to invest in lumber if they don't know what kind of policy and what kind of prices they're going to get from Britain. So, all that to say that people who had been up to that point reliant on wages earned in the lumber industry to complement whatever money they might make through agriculture, those folks are now at a loss. They need to find those wages that they had, basically budgeted for elsewhere. And there are very few opportunities for wages across Lower Canada. You might work on a neighboring farm for pretty low wages because you're part of a community and the neighbors know one another, so they're going to support one another. You're not going to get much money from your neighbor who just needs your hands for, a week at the end of the summer through the harvest. Um, Quebec City and Montreal are not industrialized in any significant way at the end of the 1830s or in the 1840s, although that starts to change very slowly. So where are they going to get those wages? There are other opportunities, and most of those are across the border in the US. So I'll offer this example first. We're going to talk about important factors in the making of expatriation, of migration, primarily transportation networks, communication networks, and kinship networks. And all these are present first and foremost along the Champlain-Richelieu pathway, if you will, waterway, um, in the beginning of the 19th century, the first 2 decades of the 19th century. And those factors will be at play as well in other regions just later on. So this is a great kind of case study, and what happens here will also be replicated in other regions of the continent, especially as we move towards the Great Lakes, the Midwest, a few, maybe not a few generations later, a few decades later, really. So in the case of the Champlain-Richelieu axis, I mentioned earlier that we had that small population of refugees that had settled after the War of Independence. And that's a small cluster of people, again, just a very small group of people who settle around Chazy, Rouse's Point, maybe a little bit further south, but not much farther beyond that, at least in the first generation. And increasingly, they'll be able to profit from cross-border trade. Trading barriers are eliminated to a certain extent, or at least drawn down after Jay's Treaty in the 1790s. So suddenly they're able to take part in a commercial economy. It's no longer just subsistence farming on the shores of Lake Champlain. Now they're able to float down rafts and take part in the lumber economy, and also through potash. We won't get into potash, but there's a lot of history around the making of potash in this period. But anyway, so they're able to make a little bit more money. And the fact that there is that commercial exchange across the border opens people's horizons. They know there are opportunities upriver along Lake Champlain, through lumber, through agriculture, industrialization, even on a small scale, proto-industrialization starts to occur along Lake Champlain before, in some respects, before Quebec City and some of these other centers in Quebec. Keysville we forget today, but Keysville was a large manufacturing center that produced nails, and they had mills and so forth. So that will help to bring people down. Those who are living in Chambly or Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu or Sorel, some of these other areas north of the border, they'll be very aware of all the products being floated down from the United States to be exported from Montreal or Quebec City. So that will kind of fine-tune their attention to what might be happening south of the border. And soon enough, they'll have kin down there as well to help lure them down to learn and take part in this commercial economy. The first of those three factors that I mentioned earlier, transportation, communication, and kinship networks. Well, we have a great example here of transportation. In 1809, this is just a few years after Robert Fulton's, we call it an invention. He, cobbles together different inventions together to create the steamboat. But within a few years, there's one that crosses the border from Burlington to Saint-Jean. And that's going to keep going up until the War of 1812. It's going to be resurrected after the War of 1812. So transportation is a big part of it, especially since using a stagecoach is, first of all, expensive in this period, especially over long distances, and extremely uncomfortable. A lot of us at this time of year complain about potholes and roads that are kind of falling apart. Well, just think about roads in the early 19th century. Very uncomfortable, unusable for months at a time, often in the fall and in the spring. During the winter, you have to rely on sleighs, and that makes for a slightly more comfortable ride, but it's very difficult. So waterways are the fastest, cheapest, and easiest means of conveyance and transportation and travel before the invention of the railway. So up until the 1830s and 40s, follow the water is my argument when it comes to tracing migrants. And we certainly have a great case of that here along the Champlain-Richelieu axis. And I mentioned earlier, they go north to the early refugees go north to have children baptized in Quebec parishes. From the 1810s, there are missionaries coming down to New York and Vermont to serve a growing Catholic population. Some are Irish, increasingly, some are also French Canadian. So we have a few really interesting reports from this period, again, touching on this specific region. I'll share a few of my favorites just to give you a sense to kind of illustrate and put a little bit of more color into all this interpretive stuff. So this is from a journalist from the Evening Post in New York City. He goes through Vermont and upstate New York. I think he even crosses the border. He writes, French Canadians come swarming upon us in the summer when we are about to begin the hay harvest, and of late years they are more numerous than formerly. Again, 1843, so it's picking up. Every farmer here has his French laborer at this season, and some two or three. They are hardy and capable of long and severe labor, but many of them do not understand a word of our language, and they are not so much to be relied upon as our countrymen. They therefore receive lower wages. So I won't get too much into the social and economic status of French Canadians once they're on, U.S. soil. Um, so, I share all this to show that there are very important elements that draw people to the United States. That doesn't mean that they're suddenly, raking in the money. They receive lower wages, and some of them will be on the margins of the host society as well. Some of it is just xenophobia and, these Yankee farmers not being very, very welcoming of Catholics, but, there's an economic incentive to bring them in still and kind of make them feel welcome to a certain extent. All right, I think I have another one here. Yeah, so this is from a decade later. Again, published. This one actually is published in Vermont, but again, concerning that migration across the border, across contiguous regions. I mean, this is just people maybe walking down or taking a steamboat. It's in some cases 20 miles, 30 miles from their home parish. So it's not very far. They're not necessarily wandering out into the unknown. They can come back if they really need to. And so the reporter in this case says, again has commenced and closed the annual migration of French Canadians. Daily have we seen them pass in companies, loaded with knapsacks and covered with the dust of travel, all dressed alike, with Canada gray trousers, homespun shirt, straw hat, and moccasins. Every year, just before haying, thousands of the French inhabitants of Canada come to this side of the line to work during haying and harvesting. They come from all parts of Lower Canada, Saint-Césaire, Saint-Hyacinthe, 50, 60, even 70 miles in some cases to work 2 months in return, carrying with them from $20 to $60 as the result of their labors, more money than they would earn in a year at home. So as we look at where French Canadians are finding the wages they used to earn either in agriculture or in logging, a lot of that is happening in Canada. Some will stay, you know, indefinitely, and they'll send remittances to their family in Canada and help pay off the farm, help support their aging parents. Others, will just stay for a few months, as this piece says, and then come back home, and they'll do that annually on a seasonal basis. And we were just discussing before we got into the Zoom meeting today with Eva and Daniel and a few others, the fact that a lot of Quebecers don't realize how many of their ancestors actually lived and stayed for a time in the United States. Partly because in many cases there are no sources, there's no information, or at least there's very little information. We have to glean from other contextual sources. But, if they spent a few summers working in the States in the 1850s, they might not be captured by census records. It might not show in parish records that, oh, this person, lately of Bradford, Vermont, or Burlington, or Winooski, or Shazy, is now, baptizing their child or something. So there's a lot more work to be done for those of you who want to join me in this enterprise of kind of recovering that early history of Franco-Americans. There's still a lot of work to be done to kind of better parse out both in terms of numbers and the experiences of these early French Canadian migrants. I'll also mention really quickly, I know our time is kind of short. I'll try to be brief here. A lot of these are very young families, the people who cross the border. And this lines up what we said earlier about Alan Greer. Established households, people who are middle-aged, who've had their plot of land for 20 years, they're doing okay. It's young people who have to seek their circumstances, better circumstances elsewhere. So here on this page, this is from Essex, New York, northern New York, close to Lake Champlain, or by Lake Champlain. You can tell that, oh, the parents are born in Canada. Maybe the eldest children are born in Canada, but very quickly they cross the US into the US. And here we have a few Anglo-Canadian families, but we also have Augustin, maybe it's Charbonneau. Yeah, I'll spend more time on it at some point. But we see that the parents are, from Canada, but all the children who are under the age of 10, they were born on the American side. So again, this is happening predominantly among young people trying to get their start in life, and a start that they can't necessarily get as well on the Canadian side of the border. So we've talked about a lot of push factors. Again, agricultural challenges, challenges with wages, and infestations and political circumstances. If we're talking in a very traditional sense about push and pull factors, we've talked about the push factors. We can talk very briefly, again, in the interest of your time, to be respectful of your time, about pull factors. The Great Republic, the United States, the fact that you have this immense area. Today we don't necessarily think about the US about as being like a gigantic country, at least not necessarily, but there's no country nearly as big in the 1820s and 30s. Even Russia is still not quite the Russia we would, imagine or picture today. Um, so it's huge. And of course, there are very few trading barriers aside from very specific state policies between states. So you have this large integrated market, which within its bounds offers free trade. It's increasingly integrated not only from the standpoint of waterways, but roadways across the Appalachians and further west. Eventually, you'll have canals. The Erie Canal is the perfect example, 1820s, and that helps to connect the Great Lakes to the eastern part, the eastern seaboard, and to connect, the Trans-Appalachian West, where a lot of the new agricultural production and industrialization is going to happen with the ports of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and so forth. So a lot is happening, is bubbling up in this period. And a lot of it is, just owes from American inventors stealing, going to Britain, observing what's happening in Britain with regard to the railway and locomotives and what's happening in mills, factories, and kind of stealing the blueprints and the designs and applying them in an American context. That's the case with Robert Fulton and a lot of the folks who are responsible for the rapid rise of the textile industry in the US. So they benefit also from, at least being creative with where they get their ideas for economic growth. We have the factory system slowly emerging, certainly emerging faster than it does in Montreal and Quebec City. And that's partly because Montreal and Quebec City are in a colony. And Britain, as the metropolis, the metropole, is going to keep the monopoly on industrial production within the British Empire for a long time. So it's going to take time for Montreal to become an economic powerhouse, as we would eventually see it. But that, again, happens earlier on the US side, um, not just through textiles, but it's happening with foundries and eventually food processing. There's a little bit of everything happening across the US, all depending on the regional strengths economically of the different regions. And then you have these proto-industrial enterprises, if you will, tanneries, sawmills, water-powered carding mills, mines, and forges, where you do have multiple production steps integrated into one location, which is what really industrialization is all about, as well as relying increasingly on machines, in this case, steam power, more than animal power or human power. So that's happening as well. And of course, the opening of the Midwest and West to white settler colonization and development. There are people out there, there are indigenous groups. As I mentioned earlier, there are even French communities, St. Louis, St. Genevieve, and so forth. But that's going to change with the construction of roads across the Appalachians, people following waterways, increasingly canals. That's going to open up the West. And increasingly, the West, will compete with Lower Canada in terms of agricultural production. And some French Canadians are going to think, well, look, we're getting outproduced and outcompeted by these folks in the West. So if we can't beat them, let's join them. And they will by the thousands. And they're going to go to northeastern Illinois, where very quickly, following Levasseur and some of these other former fur traders, following in their footsteps, they're going to create farms and try to form island communities where they can be, their own French Canadian parish with their own customs, their own language, trying to replicate what they had known back home in Lower Canada. Um, and in addition to that, you have some people moving further to um, Michigan, or not further to Michigan, but moving to Michigan to take part in the lumber industry there. So the lumber industry is on the verge of collapse in Lower Canada by the end of the 1840s. In the 1850s, you have thousands of men, predominantly, there are some families, but predominantly young men moving to Michigan to use exactly the same skills and experience that they had back in Lower Canada. So a lot of them are very resourceful. It's easy to think about migrants as being kind of in desperate conditions and desperate circumstances, but these, to pick up on Paquet and Wallo, the two authors I mentioned earlier, they're rational actors. They're going to weigh the benefits of staying at home versus moving away. And in some cases, they'll move away, earn some scratch before coming back home. And the same thing happens during the US Civil War, although from a military perspective. There are a lot of authors I can recommend. Some of you may be acquainted, especially in this group, with the French Canadians of Michigan from Jean Lamar. Try to get that focus there. And I can send some sources to Eva um, and Daniel after the talk. But that's a great resource on the movement of people from this period into Illinois, Michigan, and the Great Lakes region in general. Let's try this. There we go. And, we don't have to wait very long into the period I've been discussing to find people moving west from Lower Canada. From the moment there are canals, roads that are good enough, which isn't saying much in this period, and soon enough railways as well, they're moving into the Great Lakes. And it's kind of unfathomable to us today, just departing for a land that they've never seen. They've heard a few reports about maybe they have one, you know, cousin or brother or sister who's been there. They've gotten a letter that was read to them. They say, it's a land of opportunity. Come and join us if you're not doing too well. Next summer, come join us and build a farm here. That's daunting. So it takes a lot of courage, and you have to be resourceful not only to decide to do that, but to make it work also. So we have this report from 1836. And again, we're talking about the Richelieu River region, where you have that immense population growth that we talked about earlier. An immense tide of emigration towards Illinois and Michigan has commenced lately throughout the parishes on the banks of the Richelieu in southern Lower Canada, which promises to continue during the summer. It is limited to Canadian farmers who are selling off their property and are bent upon establishing themselves in the far west. 300 have left St. John's this season, Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu. Almost every steamboat that leaves carries off 20 to 30 of them. It is said that some Canadians who have been in Michigan and were successful in their operations have returned to Lower Canada. Not permanently, though. Their representations have been of a nature to excite many of their friends to follow them back, to follow their example in Michigan. Again, this is from the 1830s, so much earlier than where the conventional story of Franco-Americans, is made to begin in many works. I have another one here. And again, I'll kind of be brief in the next few slides just so we can conclude and hopefully have a vigorous Q&A period. Canadian immigration. This is from a few decades later. Canadian immigration is occurring on a large scale. At this point, we're talking about the railroad. Today, there were at the Grand Trunk Station in Toronto nearly 100 Canadians with the U.S. as their destination. These people are, for the most part, residents of the district of Trois-Rivières, between Quebec and Montreal. Last Saturday, Captain Maillot of Verchères left, we are told, the village with 85 Canadians to go establish a town in Illinois. This town will be named Doda, and the immigrants are, for the most part, young and strong. They are exporting, beyond their energy and intelligence, fairly significant capital. So in this case, we have, again, not people who are particularly desperate, but who might be selling their farm, they have some cash, and they're ready for a new start in a foreign land. And they're going to invest the money that they've earned, that they've amassed, maybe over the course of years. Often this is planned. They've amassed a lot of capital, and they're going to spend it on a farm and investments further west on the American side. So this is just kind of to wrap up some of the themes I've been talking about with regard to the West, which has a somewhat different story from what we see in New England and upstate New York. So you have rapid development of rail lines south of the border. The Continental Railway on the Canadian side won't be completed until 1885. So that's generations later. Um, the the American Intercontinental Railway is completed in 1869, if I remember correctly, but well before that, or cross-continental railway. But well before that, even long before the 1860s, you have railways reaching Chicago and some of these other hubs, St. Louis, enabling people to move much farther, much more quickly, and then to return home as well on occasion, and to establish these cross-community ties that will enable kin as well to follow in their footsteps and spur chain migration. And it's kind of funny to look at the literature on the topic because there are very few works of Franco-American history or French-Canadian history in the US that tackles both the East and the West. And maybe it just seems too daunting. We talk about the textiles in the East, and then there are all these other communities out West that don't get, the same level of attention. And that's kind of paradoxical because as of 1860, through that first phase of migration, half of all French Canadians that come to the US, they settle in the Midwest and West, right? Half. And eventually that changes because of the growth of industry. But to me, that means that we need to pay more attention to those communities, especially in Quebec, where I'm from. I grew up and I never heard anything about Franco-American communities, you know, east of whatever, New York State, if you will. So there's work to be done there for those of you who want to join me in that challenge. But I know a lot of you do good work by blending notably genealogy and history, which is very significant in this Western region, the Great Lakes region. And of course, there are distinct place names, Papineau and Jatsi, and we have Sainte-Anne and Faribault and a bunch of other locations that still, Dubuque as well, that pay tribute to that French presence. And in these parishes out west, it's not just in the east that they have, French Canadians have newspapers and schools and churches and so forth. Many of you know this from experience from being, for those of you who are in the Midwest, but there are French parishes and Catholic schools and political gatherings and congresses and conventions of French Canadian folks out west, as well as newspaper. There are a few newspapers that, don't last very long in Chicago, but you have L'Écho de l'Ouest, published in Minnesota, and it's going to last more than 50 years. So that's pretty impressive. Or sorry, more than 40 years. I'll mention this quickly as well. I see our time is kind of running out, but these are locations in the US in yellow. These are all US locations where you have French Canadian organized communities prior to 1861. Now there are French Canadians all over the place, well beyond these few handfuls of communities. But this is where we either have a school, a church, something tangible that shows a community organizing for a common venture prior to the Civil War. And many of those, about half of those, are in New York State, which again doesn't get the attention it should. But you also have Chicago and St. Anne. I haven't talked a whole lot about Northeastern Illinois. Again, time being of the essence here, and we're kind of pressed. But there's this important figure by the name of Father Shiniki. Some of you have heard of him. There's a book that came out from Carolyn, I think it's pronounced Brettel or Bretel, Finding Father Shiniki, and it's all about the experience of French Canadians in Northeastern Illinois. So I encourage you to check that out for more information about those experiences through the 1840s and 50s, experiences which include religious schism. So it's really unique and interesting. So there are push factors, there are pull factors. I mentioned again, transportation, communication networks, meaning eventually it's the telegraph that I've pictured here, but also letters, newspaper reports. That's all part of communication, mass communication or personal communication, and kinship networks. So one of my pitches to you today, among many others, is that we need to pay attention, yes, to push factors, yes, to pull factors, but what connects the push and pull? It doesn't suffice for things to look great on the other side of the border. You need some point of connection to lead you there. And so let's look at networks a little bit more emphatically as we go through our research, like what brought a person from point A to point B in terms of physical infrastructure, but also in terms of what might have driven them, motivated them. Did they have kin? Did they have access to special information that would have made these regions specifically tantalizing? So that's all I'm going to say about this slide. Again, I want to leave time for questions and answers. I'm also going to skip over this. So I have a lot of numbers here, and you've been very patient so far with me in terms of listening and hopefully absorbing some of what I have to share. If we have questions about numbers, we can come back to it in the Q&A period. Um, and I wanted to point that out. I should have changed the title here. But as of 1900, leading states with people who were born in French Canada. This doesn't include second generation, well, I should say first generation Americans, meaning those who were born in the US. It doesn't include second generation Americans. So people whose parents were born in Canada, grandparents, and so forth, they're not included here. So this does not fully represent the whole number of people who would have identified as French Canadians in 1900. But of course, you have the usual suspects, Massachusetts and New Hampshire, which drew a considerable population, migrant population from Quebec. You also have Michigan up there, and Minnesota and Wisconsin. And I think state number 11 is Illinois. So again, we need to pay attention to some of these states um, well beyond New England. And it goes to show that that migratory process doesn't end in 1860, when again about half of the population is living in the Midwest, half of the French Canadian population is living in the Midwest. 40 years later, you still have significant populations of recent arrivals, recent migrants in some of these Western states. So we need to pay attention to both, and there are different factors and different circumstances that lead migrants to the West versus the East. And, you know, it would take a few more lectures to parse those out, but maybe we'll touch upon those themes in the next few minutes. Okay, so again, you've been very patient, and I see that some of you are still, your eyes are still open, and you still seem to be paying attention, and I'm very grateful for that. That was a very low bar, but I'm glad I was able to clear that. I appreciate your interest in the topic, your interest in attending, hopefully your interest in supporting the French Canadian Heritage Society of Michigan that do great work month after month. So hopefully you've seen that membership form in the comments. It's probably buried, but I think somebody's going to add it again just so you can sign up for those of you who are just discovering the Heritage Society for the first time today. Here's my contact. And, you know, I'm going to soon close down the shared presentation. So if you haven't jotted down my name, you can reach out to Eva or Daniel or anyone from the Heritage Society. They'll be able to share my information with you. And hopefully we can keep this conversation going beyond our time together today. But I've seen the little banner at the top of my screen pop down every time there's a comment. There are a lot of comments and I think some questions as well. So I think we should get to that. But thank you for paying attention.
Thank you, Patrick, for sharing the book titles, since I neglected to mention them earlier. We do have some questions. I think we've got about a half a dozen people. Kristen, do you want to unmute yourself and ask Patrick the first question?
I think I asked a couple, so now I don't remember
Okay.
which ones I asked. I am interested. I have two ancestors who migrated from Amherstburg over to Detroit around 1865, and was wondering if that was related to the US Civil War. I think it's industrial, but I'm just kind of curious if you can speak to that.
All right.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually kind of hard to parse out, especially if in later census we see that somebody migrated in 1862 or 3, or even in the last year of the war, as with your ancestors. You know, if we're talking about the East, and I know that's not the case with your family, there's an industrial boom that occurs halfway through the Civil War. So the loss of cotton from the South imperils textile production in the East for a few years, and then things jut up again, especially as New Orleans is taken from the Confederates. I'm getting into the weeds here, but it's to show that, 1863, did a person come down to work in a textile mill that was suddenly being reinvigorated by the supply of cotton? Or is it because they saw that now the federal government was offering bounties to people who would enlist, or perhaps enlist on behalf of somebody who was wealthier, who could, pay themselves off to not go to war? So It's a tough question without knowing all the very specifics of your family, but it's possible that it's both. And at this time, I know that your immigrant ancestors moved from Amherstburg, which is not the same as, the St. Lawrence River Valley necessarily. But we have best estimates, 15 to maybe 20,000 people who are residing in what is today Quebec, who signed up to serve in the Civil War and for whom we have actual records. So that's a considerable population. And that's another factor we have to take into account. And in fact, military enlistments on the part of French Canadians starts in the 1840s. In the 1840s, we have hundreds of Canadians who sign up to fight in the Mexican-American War. And they end up in Texas and Mexico, and they take part in the siege of Mexico City. So all that to say that French Canadians were not averse to participating, even though, the American army is a foreign environment, even though their commanding officers probably won't have any grasp of French, it's a worthwhile investment for thousands and thousands of them to sign up and take part in some of these conflicts, especially if they're going to earn, $500 easily that they can, yeah, exactly, bring back to their home parish, to their home farm. So this isn't very helpful, but I think both are very good possibilities.
Wow. Yeah, it's so fascinating. Okay, next I've got Janine Coutinho. I'm sorry if I'm slaughtering the last name.
Um, I put a couple of comments in related to the American Revolutionary French Canadians, where people can check the list, the DAR list, on maybe one of theirs is involved there, and you can make an application to the DAR. And I also asked if Patrick would just talk a little bit, a few decades later, about the French Canadians who went to New England to work in the textile mills. I have ancestors there. They would go down in the late 1800s for a few months or a year or two, then they'd go back to Quebec. And then eventually both my sides of the family came to Rhode Island in the 1820s to live permanently and work the textile mills.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's terrific. Great question. And this could be a 15-week class on immigration to New England. So I'll try to be brief, but there are a lot of really great books out there that are worth checking out. That's really what makes a difference between New England and the Midwest after 1860 is this explosion of industrial growth, especially in places not in Boston, but in this wide arc of mid-level, mid-sized cities from Woonsocket through Fall River, Worcester, not so much, some in Western Mass, then of course Lowell and Nashua and Manchester and Biddeford and so forth. So a lot of these names are pretty well known to some of you who've been doing research, ancestry research on New England. And one of the benefits of participating in this paid labor in textile mills is the fact that oftentimes the entire family is employed, not the youngest children of all, but you do have children for a while who are under the age of 10 or about 10 and through their teen years who are employed alongside perhaps their mother or somebody else in their family. The labor engagement of men is a little bit different. There are men who are employed in textile mills, but not at the same level as women and children proportionally. But that's one of the great benefits of going there is that, every member of the family will be in a very crass and capitalistic way, they'll be earning their keep, really, that they'll be contributing to the household economy and make sure that there's income. And this is not particularly surprising because on a family farm, it's the same thing. On a family farm, everyone's going to be pulling their weight. And from some of you may have grown up on a farm, from age 6 or 7 or 8, you're doing farm chores. So for a lot of French Canadian families, they just bring that mindset with them that of course you're going to, take part in the family economy and work in textile mills, although naturally qualitatively, the type of work is very different. But that's what makes the difference and why New England takes off in terms of the concentration of French Canadian population. And the story you share is very common for Franco-Americans in the Northeast. I have ancestors who lived for a time and stayed in New England, worked in a textile factory for a few years, and came back. So I'm one of the descendants of those who came back, but many stayed and, gave rise to these incredible Franco-American communities, which just being more numerous and being more concentrated, were able to sustain their distinct institutions for much longer.
All right.
Thanks. Thank you.
Louise Pilon Graham, did you have a question or comment for Patrick?
It's her husband, David.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But that's okay, because I lost the link.
Looking good there, Louise.
Thanks. I wanted to ask Patrick, in this migration, was it primarily the men who were migrating out to the Midwest? Or did they take their women with them? And if they did not take their women with them, did that serve to unfrancophone the Midwest by marrying with Anglophone women?
Ah.
So, to be a little bit cryptic, yes and no, but I promise there's an explanation that comes with that. In the case of the lumber camps in Michigan, that is to an extent a seasonal migration of men who regularly return to the home country, and these are predominantly male environments. They work in lumber camps, and they're not there necessarily to establish households. That's different, as I'm sure you know and suspect, from the migrations we have to northeastern Illinois, Bourbonnais, and Saint Anne and Papineau, that region, just really not too far from Chicago, actually, and in Wisconsin and northern Minnesota, just like as you go straight south from Winnipeg and Manitoba, you go to northern Minnesota. Virgil Benoit had a great article on that. He's done a lot of really great research on those communities. And it's been shown pretty persuasively that in agricultural settings, typically it's the entire family that migrates, partly because it's a much bigger commitment. You're selling the farm, and it's the entire family that's going to uproot and, create a new life for themselves in a different setting. Unfortunately, I haven't done enough research to be able to tell you, how many of those young men who went to Michigan stayed in Michigan to marry local Yankee women or other immigrant women versus those who came back to Quebec. But for the young people in the group, there's a great dissertation topic in there. I don't think it's been done before.
Then next I had Jill Morelli. She had made some comments about the Charlebois family immigrating to Wisconsin, and some family members serving in the Civil War. Changed the name to Wood, from Charlebois to Wood. Always makes ancestral connections interesting, right? With all these French Canadian name changes.
Yeah. I was asked, so we have these near monthly genealogical workshops in person at the archives. Eventually, they might be virtual for those who are interested. But somebody was, I was telling them with virtual platforms, you have to be very creative because a lot of these names are spelled phonetically. So if you just search for Lacroix or Dubois or Rioux, you're not going to get, the whole range of possible names or the whole family necessarily. And somebody was asking me, so is there a list of all these phonetic derivations? And unless we can get into the minds of all these different census takers, Anglophone census takers, we're never going to have, I think, a comprehensive list. So it takes a lot of creativity, and you have to think really phonetically and know what the Quebec phonetics are, the Quebec pronunciation, and then try to transcribe that, test that into different search engines or databases. So it's, that's part of the fun, I think, and part of the challenge of historical and genealogical workshops.
Yes, yes.
Richard, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Richard Talbot, and I'm happy to be here. First of all, I just want to applaud you, Patrick, on your presentation. And something that I notice is that whenever a question is posed to you, sometimes I'll watch your face, and it looks like you know, I know you're doing the best you can, but I applaud you with the work that you do because it's a real difficult job. I know it is. I haven't done it at your level, but my genealogy work that I do, presents me with a lot of mysteries and different things that I have to kind of figure out. And for you to be able to turn around and address questions is just, I marvel at that, for one thing. But the one thing that you said a couple of times during your presentation that was really interesting, um, because I run into that in my genealogy work, is sometimes I have people like in Maine themselves that where my ancestry through my father, my paternal ancestry, it shows that there's children from French Canadian family through my French Canadian heritage that were born in Maine, yet they were christened in Canada. And I kind of, well, before I cite something, a fact that actually proves it, it certainly arises my curiosity. But I think to some degree I understand that through the churches sometimes that you use the word allegiance about other things, but I think I can't think of a better word to use it with regards to a faith that maybe that they did that because I had some that were in Biddeford, but geez, they got christened up in Canada, Bar Canada, which is the lower part. And I sit there and I go, wow, they made that long trip just to get their kid christened and stuff like that. So I was figuring maybe you could just reflect a little bit on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Especially once we get into the era of the textile industry. There are a lot of families that are just going to leave, Fall River or Biddeford or some of these other locations mid-June, late June, early July, and they're going to be off for a few weeks or a month. It's partly because the factories get unbelievably hot and uncomfortable during that period. And some factories actually close down entirely for like about a month in the summertime. So that's a great opportunity for these families to go back and visit. So I guess what I'm saying is that they're not necessarily going back only to baptize. Sometimes it's part of a larger strategy. They're going to reconnect with family. They're going to bring back some of their earnings, maybe support their elderly parents in Quebec and so forth. So, or maybe they'll attend a wedding. Maybe somebody's brother is getting married. Um, but certainly in the early years of the migration, before you have all these institutions, before you have like large sprawling textile mills, it's true that you have a lot of records in Quebec, parish records, baptisms, especially. It's not very convenient to bring back a body, so we have very few burials of people who are living in the US, but certainly baptisms that are being recorded in Quebec parishes. And very often there's a fairly lengthy period of time between the birth and the baptism. So they don't necessarily do it the moment somebody is born. They'll wait a few months until it's convenient economically and otherwise to go back to Quebec. That's something I've noticed in my family tree, and I'm not saying that this is the norm or a hard and fast rule, but oftentimes it'll be months afterwards, or there'll be a gap between um, uh, from the moment somebody leaves and Quebec goes to the US, comes back, and you'll see that a child has been born during that time, and they're only baptized once they're back decidedly and permanently in Lower Canada. So it makes for a challenge, as you're describing, to actually trace family histories through that, especially since in some cases they're just going to say in the parish record, "Oh, born a year ago," without giving the actual date, or get born 8 months ago in the United States without providing more context. But it's a great reminder. Your question is a great reminder for me and the whole group that a big part of the story of migration is actually in Quebec parish records, because it might be that if it weren't for those parish records where it say that that child was baptized to parents in the US, we would never know that they were even in the US.
Yeah, thank you very much for that answer. Because I just that explains an awful lot the gap that I used to find between the birth and the actual christening. And I'd sit there and I'd go, my God, why'd they wait so long? Because more often than not, when it's somebody that's been locally born and just goes to the church that they're within, that explains the gap. But that shows the difference between the traveling that they had to do and if they do it locally, what ends up happening is that it's either the same day or it's the day after that they get christened and stuff. So thank
Yeah,
you very much for that answer.
sure. And I noticed somebody mentioned, Edwin mentioned circuits. that were performed in the US by priests who were the pastors of a parish in Quebec, but who also served as missionaries. Famously, Father Mignot is one of them, who for about 50 years, year after year, he does his circuit, missionary circuit from Chambly through upstate New York, through Vermont, comes back. And in some cases, those records are, we think, lost to time. Maybe eventually, somebody's going to open up their attic and they're going to realize, oh, here are, 50 years of parish records. That's unlikely to happen. So part of the challenge also is there were probably more children baptized in the US than we suspect, but those missionary records are very hard to find if they exist.
Okay. We got a lot of nice thank yous in the chat. Appreciate everyone participating. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Eva.
Well, welcome. Thank you. Again, your presentation was fantastic, Patrick. I think we had a wonderful group of people. Questions and answers were appreciated by everybody. I'm going to open up the mic to anybody that wants to say a last minute question or a comment. Please feel free to raise your hand and unmute. Otherwise, I'd like to welcome you again to our next month's presentation. And if you're not a member, you can go to the website, habitatheritage.org, and you'll find a link there as well. We'll be reaching out to people that are in this meeting to give you more information. And again, thank you again, Patrick. It was a wonderful afternoon to spend with you. I was amazed at the graphs. In particular, they were fantastic. It really put into perspective the migration itself. So thank
I
you
appreciate
again for
that.
that. Absolutely
I'm
wonderful.
I'm very
Welcome.
honored. Again, it's fun for me to see familiar faces and to meet new folks who are getting into the conversation. So I hope you'll all stay in touch with me, definitely with the Heritage Society as well. But if you have any other questions, you can Google my name, Acadian Archives, you'll find me. And I'll try to provide as much support as I can. No promises, but we're all in this together and I'll be glad to help.
Absolutely. And again, thank you so much. Enjoy your holiday, your Easter, your family, and your French Canadian heritage. Appreciate you all. Come back again. Thank you.